Psalm 23, a psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Before we begin this morning, I just want to acknowledge the difficulty of this moment, the hurt that sits in this room that many of you, many of us have carried this week, and it weighs on us even now. And the fact that I'm the one standing here right now instead of someone else is a reminder of that hurt. I want to point out that there's no need to shy away from that, to pretend like the hurt isn't there. But as we said from the beginning this morning, our God graciously meets us in the midst of our hurts. His word speaks to our wounds, to our fears, to our uncertainties, and he leads us in mercy to find healing in himself. And that's what I hope for. That's what I hope for this time together as we study his word. I don't like to tell many stories when I preach, but I will tell this one. In World War II, the USS Indianapolis was torpedoed just a little after midnight on July 30th, 1945. The ship sank in 12 minutes, with about 300 souls still trapped inside who went down with the ship, leaving another about 900 men adrift in the open ocean of the Pacific, with very few lifeboats and many of them not even with life jackets. It'd be 4 days before a plane on patrol would see them and rescue operations would commence. 4 days floating in the middle of the ocean with little to no food or water and sharks circling below, snatching a sailor from the surface now and again while the rest of them looked on hopelessly. And only 316 people would survive to be rescued. But some of those men tell the story of floating there, waiting for rescue while their friends died around them from exposure and thirst and sharks, when someone began to pray these familiar words of comfort and hope. And then some others joined in and they prayed together, floating there in the middle of the ocean, "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Don't misunderstand. I do not believe that our ship has sunk. And yet even still, maybe some of you have felt like you're floating in the open seas. Maybe it's felt like there are sharks circling beneath you. And I hope that these words, probably very familiar words for many of you, may hold some comfort. They might serve as a life raft for you to hold on to. The Lord is our shepherd. These are familiar words, and yet I think there are still unplumbed depths, still to explore, more to find beneath its surface, and perhaps there are parts of it that we've even misunderstood before. One commentator, Derek Kidner, writes, "Depth and strength underlie the simplicity of this psalm. Its peace is not escape. Its contentment is not complacency. There is a readiness to face deep darkness and imminent attack. And the climax reveals a love which homes towards no material goal, but to the Lord himself. Its peace is not escape. Its contentment is not complacency. The psalmist doesn't try to avoid the realities of darkness and suffering and fear, but there's a readiness to face them. And so we'll need to ask, where does that readiness come from? What is it that makes you able to face deep darkness and yet find a peace, but a peace that isn't just escape? How can you face that darkness and be truly content and not just complacent? It's not just shrugging off the hurt and pretending like everything's okay when it very obviously isn't. Because I think there's more to this psalm than just a quaint sentimentality that paints a silver lining in a dark cloud. There's a readiness, a willingness to walk into the valley of the shadow of death, as deep as the darkness goes, and yet there's still to find peace. Where does that come from? I'll give you a hint. I think the answer is in the very first word. The Lord is our shepherd. And so let's talk about who this Lord is. You may know that when you find the word Lord spelled like this in your Bible with the capital L and the smaller capital O-R-D, I couldn't do that on the screen very well. It's not just a title for God, like master or ruler, but this is actually a placeholder for the personal name of God. There was a tradition by the Hebrew scribes who assembled our texts of the Old Testament that whenever the divine name, the name of God, appeared in a scroll that they were copying, they would copy the consonants of the name. But then they would write in the vowels of another word, usually the word Adonai. And so they would do this so that when someone was reading the scroll and they came across the divine name, they wouldn't read the consonants, but they would read the word that was written in the vowels. And out of reverence, not wanting to take the Lord's name in vain, as the law commands, they would read the vowels and say Adonai, which means Lord or Master or Sovereign. And so many of our English translations have inherited that tradition, that whenever the divine name appears in the text, they substitute it with Lord, spelled with the capital L and then the smaller capital O-R-D. There's something admirable, I think, about this reverence. There's something good, particularly since reverence isn't something that we tend to do very well these days. And we should rightly have an incredible reverence and awe for the holy name of our awesome God. And yet that holy, awesome God chose to reveal this name to us. And while he's no less deserving of our reverence, he's also given us access in his Son to approach his throne with confidence and boldness. I also tend to think that taking, or rather carrying God's name in vain, as the commandment says, really has more to do with how we live than what we say or even what we call God. But maybe more relevant to our points, God revealed his personal name, the name that he revealed to Moses from the burning bush. He gave this name to his people because that name actually means something. It says something about who God is. He is Lord and Master and Sovereign. Those things are true of him, and yet that's not what his name means. But the name here in Psalm 23 is the name that appears throughout a lot of the Old Testament, the name that God revealed to Moses from the burning bush when he said, I am who I am. God said his name is I am. And so the scriptures call him, he said his name is I am, and so the name that the scriptures call him is actually he is, in Hebrew, Yahweh, the being one. The one who is. And what that name tells us about God, or rather reminds us about him, is that God is completely and utterly different from everyone and everything else that we know. Because everything else has a beginning, and it will have an end. Everything else was made and can be unmade, but Yahweh was not made. His existence depends on nothing and no one outside of himself. He simply was and is and ever shall be exactly who he has always been, the uncreated one. And so he does not change. But then also, since this name is the name that was revealed in the burning bush, it's also intended to evoke all the ideas about God as he reveals himself in the Exodus. The name Yahweh is the name of a redeemer. He's the God who heard the groaning of his people when they were oppressed as slaves in the land of Egypt. The God who judged their captors with a mighty hand and outstretched arm and delivered them through the waters of the sea. He's a rescuer who saves his people and delivers them from death. All of this is wrapped up in that name. All of these ideas are being activated and called to mind when the psalmist says, the Lord, Yahweh. He's the being one, the uncreated, unchanging, unfailing God who was and is to come. And he's also the Redeemer who hears the cries of his people and rescues them up out of their affliction. The Lord, Yahweh, is our shepherd. And so the psalmist says, I shall not want. Here's that contentment that we talked about earlier. It's not so much a statement about being satisfied as it is a declaration of trust in the shepherd. The verb here is in a tense that it works kind of like a generalizing kind of description, talking about the normal state of things. I shall not want sounds nice and poetic, but maybe also just maybe a little too extravagant to really wrap our heads around. It's saying, Yahweh is my shepherd. I don't lack. I don't go without. He takes care of what I need. It's like that quote said earlier. It's so simple, and yet there's a depth that lies beneath that simplicity. Yahweh, the Lord, is my shepherd. And so I have what I need. And of course, everything that follows from here is all adopting the imagery of that control metaphor of shepherding, right? Yahweh is said to do the things that a good shepherd does. But before we go on, I think we need to deal with the images that come into our minds when we read these things in order for us to really understand it very well. Because when we hear these things about green pastures and still waters, I'm betting that what comes to our mind is an idyllic kind of picture of a lush, grassy hillside with a soft, babbling brook running gently down the hill, sheep grazing in peace and serenity. But the thing is that can't be what the ancient Israelite psalmist, likely David or someone after him, that can't be what he had in mind when he wrote this psalm, mainly because that picture doesn't exist in the land of the Bible. David would have never seen anything that looks like that in his entire life. There are no lush, vibrant hillsides in the land of Palestine and the Levant. The land of Israel is a desert. And sure, there are a few areas that are a little more fertile where they can grow crops and build cities, but But that's not where the sheep are. The farmland is way too rare and far too valuable of a resource to let the flocks, the sheep and the sheep and the goats run around free on it. No, the shepherds with their flocks and herds they're out away from the farms, away from the towns and villages, in the wilderness of the desert. And so when the psalmist says, he makes me lie down in green pastures, he's not talking about a lush, grassy hillside as green as far as the eye can see. I'm not terribly sure the word in that passage actually even means green, to be honest. It seems like it means something more like pastures of young grass or pastures of sprouting grass, because grass can't grow very tall in the desert before it's scorched by the heat. I think what we should have in mind here isn't so much a lush hillside, but patches of short grass, maybe around the base of the rocks, where the rain settles just long enough to let something start to grow. And maybe if the sun hits it just right, maybe you can see a little glimpse of green somewhere in there. Maybe on a good day. And I think it's the same idea with those still waters. I think we've taken that to mean sometimes, I've heard it explained to me, is that it's talking about a gently flowing stream as opposed to a roaring river, so that the sheep wouldn't get carried away by the current. It's a safe place for them to drink, but there are no roaring rivers or whitewater rapids in the desert either. The picture here isn't a soft babbling brook, but something more like a puddle, where the rain gathers just enough so that it doesn't dry up quite as fast as everywhere else. There's a little puddle of standing water where the sheep can find a sip or two out to drink out in the wilderness. Most of the rest of the time, the shepherds watered their flocks at wells. But when they're out in the desert, probably looking for their next bit of grass to eat, the well is pretty far away. And the best you can find in the wilderness is not likely to be a soft babbling brook, but more likely just a mud puddle with a little bit of standing water in it. And I think this paints a different picture for us. The place where the shepherd is leading his flocks isn't a lush hillside, but the desert. And the desert is not a land of abundance. The desert is the land of just enough. In the desert, you'll never find a place where you're set for life. You'll never find a rolling hill of green grass as far as the eye can see. You'll never find fresh flowing water to last you the rest of your days. In other words, you'll never find a place where you can stop having to trust the shepherd. He'll lead you to what you need right now, here, in this moment, but tomorrow is something different. There isn't enough here for tomorrow, maybe not even enough for 10 minutes from now. There's no abundance to be found in the wilderness, but there is just enough. And tomorrow the shepherd will lead the way to the next little patch of grass, the next little puddle of standing water where you can quench your thirst. But he'll take you to those places and he'll restore your soul. He will refresh you with what you need right here, right now, not tomorrow, not 10 minutes from now, but here in this moment, you will have enough. You will be able to see, you may not be able to see where the next bit of grass might be, but the shepherd knows where to find it. That's what he's there for, and he will lead you there. He will lead you to the next bit of grass, the next little mud puddle. Once this pasture is all chewed up, he will lead you, it says, by paths of righteousness. And I think that can sound a little sanctimonious. Paths of righteousness. We might say a little more simply, he leads me in right paths. The righteousness isn't the wrong word. Believe it or not, we're still following the shepherding metaphor here. If we have that picture back up, you might be able to see those little grooves along the side of the hill where the sheep are grazing. those places where the sheep have tread these level paths over time, where they can walk along and graze on the crunchy brown grass somewhat safely, maybe with a little less chance of tumbling down the hill. Those little grooves, I'm told, really are called paths of righteousness, right paths. And I know that sounds just a little too convenient. It seems too good to be true. There's a nice, neat, tidy little connection there for us, and I was a little skeptical of it too. But I'm telling you, I checked it out. I found a few legitimate academic journal articles, and I thoroughly read the titles of those articles. and as far as I can tell you, I do think it's true. It seems like that really is the connection that's being made here, that those little grooves along the side of the hill are paths of righteousness. I'm not going to hang too much on that metaphor, but I think we can pretty simply just say our shepherd leads us to walk in righteousness, to live righteous lives, following after him, walking in his ways. And I can say a little more confidently here that righteousness can have two dimensions. On the one hand, righteousness can be about covenant faithfulness, about being obedient to the commands of the covenant that God has made with his people. Being righteous can simply mean obeying God and being faithful to him, faithful to what he has said, faithful to walk in the paths that he has said are well tread, that are safe. But then on the other hand, righteous can also have a horizontal dimension. Righteousness can mean living righteously towards other people and doing right by them. And I think both of these ideas of righteousness are in view here. Following our shepherd means doing right by God and doing right by the people around us. And of course, that's a lot easier said than done. But it's not terribly complicated either, because in a sense, you just follow the shepherd. You listen to his voice. And let's not miss the reason that the psalmist gives here. He leads us in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. God's name is wrapped up in his care for us. His reputation is at stake in whether he leads us safely and takes care of our needs. If we understand that the whole world exists for the glory of God, for the renown of his name, then how much more can we be sure that our God will be faithful? That he's staked his name on caring for his sheep. And that's what it means that we will be his people and he will be our God. He can't let us down because it would compromise everything that he is. Everything that he was and is and ever shall be, because he's a faithful, unchanging God. And so he will care for us. He will lead us in righteousness. But I also want to point out the way that this leads into the next line. It seems like those paths of righteousness will sometimes lead through the valley of the shadow of death. There's some disagreement here whether the word here is really the shadow of death and that big, great, ominous thing, or something more just like plain darkness. I think evidence is pointing towards the big, ominous sounding thing, the shadow of death, I think really is there. But I think it carries the same idea all the same either way. It's painting a picture of when, for the shepherdry metaphor, right? When the flock is traveling out in the wilderness, away from the safety of the fold, and they're caught out at night, when the invisible threats of predators like those bears and lions that King David protected his flock from, those threats loom out in the darkness. And in the narrow turns of the valleys between the mountains, you can't always see what might be waiting around the next corner. And when there's every reason for a helpless, defenseless sheep to be terrified, the psalmist says, "Even though I walk through the valley of death's shadow, I will fear no evil. Or maybe I will fear no harm, no danger. He says, for you are with me. Think about that kind of trust, to be able to say, I can walk into dark and dangerous places. Willingly, freely, of my own accord, I can walk into a place where harm could very well come to me, because that's where doing the right thing might take me, because that's what it might take to be righteous towards God and my neighbor. That's what it might take to love the people that God has put in front of me. And in the midst of that dark place, I can simply not be afraid, because my shepherd is there with me. His rod and his staff, they comfort me. And why should we be afraid when we have this kind of shepherd? Yahweh, the being one, the one who has always been, whose existence and whose faithfulness depends on nothing outside himself. The one who was and is and ever shall be. He is our shepherd. The one who ransomed his people from bondage of slavery with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Who divided the Red Sea and brought his people up out of the land of death in Egypt. Who rained down bread from heaven for 40 years until they reached the land of promise. The one who descended on the holy mountain with fire and smoke, and spoke with the roar of thunder and said, I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. You shall be my people, and I shall be your God. That's our shepherd. Yahweh, the Lord of hosts, the Holy One of Israel. He is our shepherd. And so we shall not want. We lack nothing. We may not have the luxury of lush pastures and babbling brooks, but here in the desert, in the wilderness outside of Eden, we will have our just enough. We may not know what happens tomorrow, but we will trust in our shepherd, because he knows the places where there's a little patch of grass with some green still in it. He knows where the puddles of rainwater hang around for a few days after the storm. And he will lead us to walk there, to the resources that he has provided us. He will lead us to walk to them in righteousness. And even though that path leads through the dark valley, our shepherd will protect us. His rod and his staff, the power and the authority that he wields over even the broken parts of this world. That power, his rod, will protect us, and they will comfort us. Before we move on from the shepherd metaphor to what we find in verses 5 and 6, they're a little bit different. I just feel the need to say, we had a shepherd who failed us. But the Lord is our shepherd. And he is with us in the dark of the valley, because he's the shepherd who came to be like one of his sheep, who put on wool and drank from mud puddles. He knows how it feels to walk in the desert where you can't see any green grass. He's felt what it's like to be weak and helpless like we are. He's felt the hurt of being let down, betrayed by someone he counted as a friend. And as deep as our hurt can possibly go, Jesus has been there. And here in this wilderness, in the valley where nothing is left untouched by the curse of death's shadow, he is in every way with us. And I think that's where we find that readiness that the psalmist has to face the shadow of darkness, to let ourselves feel the hurt that we've experienced, and instead of trying to escape it, to find real peace and instead of just escape and pretending like the wounds just really aren't all that deep. Because no matter how deep the valley might go, our shepherd has already been there. And he sits there waiting to comfort us. And yet, one day, we have the promise that he will heal this wilderness. That he will make streams of living water to flow across the parched deserts. We live in the desert because the paradise of the garden was broken by sin. And the wilderness is all that's left of a war-torn land broken by rebellion. And yet we are promised that even this parched desert land is being made new. Isaiah 41, God says, "I will open rivers on the bare heights and fountains in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water and the dry land springs of water. I will put in the wilderness the cedar, the acacia, the myrtle, and the olive. I will set in the desert the cypress, the plane and the pine together, that they may see and know, may consider and understand together that the hand of the Lord has done this. The Holy One of Israel has created it." The desert is being made into a garden once again. Water will spring up out of the dry ground, and groves of trees will be planted in the wilderness. The curse of sin is being undone in the wounds of our good shepherd, Jesus. And everything that has been broken will one day be made new. And I think that's happening even right here, even in Psalm 23, because it says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." We might understand this as relating to the comforts, right? The confidence and reassurance that was mentioned before, the comfort from his rod and staff. Like it's the absence of fear and in the face of adversaries, maybe even in the dark valley. But I think there's something different that's happening here. Because it seems like we've parted ways with the shepherd metaphor here at the end of the psalm. Because sheep don't eat at tables. And the Bible usually doesn't scoff at very real threats. It doesn't take the threat of enemies lightly, to make light of them so much as to enjoy a feast while they prowl off in the distance. I think that when you have a feast in the presence of your enemies, it's only after those enemies have been defeated. When they're bound in chains, looking on at the festivities of the victory celebration. And I think that's the hope that the psalmist is pointing us towards, that there's a hope on the other side of the wilderness when the enemies will be defeated. And at that victory feast, we who are tired and hurt from our hard journeys through the wilderness, we will have our weariness refreshed with rich oil poured on our heads. We who for so long drank meager sips from mud puddles in the deserts will be given cups overflowing with well-aged wine. And we hope in that feast that is yet to come. We long for that day when all things will finally be redeemed. And here in the meantime, here in the desert, he leads us through the parched land of just enough, showing us day by day that he is a good shepherd, proving to us day by day that he loves us, and teaching us to trust him as we look to the hope that lies on the other side of the desert, on that day after our enemies are defeated. Surely goodness and mercy will follow us all the days of our life, and we will dwell in the Lord's house forever. Pray with me. Father, we thank you that this is true. that you are our good shepherd, and so we have everything we need. Because you have lived in this wilderness, and you are well acquainted with the desert, and you can lead us to the places where our souls can find rest, where you can restore us, even as you teach us to trust you amidst our fears and uncertainties, even in the darkness of our own hurt. Father, go with us. Remind us of your presence. Lead us to walk in righteousness before you. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.